Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of 𝙁𝙗𝙗?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hi, this is Peter Schweizer, and welcome to The Drill Down, where we relentlessly expose cronyism, corruption, and the abuse of power in Washington, D.C. The co-host of this program, of course, is Eric Eggers. Eric, we have a very special guest today, and that is Miranda Devine. You know her from the New York Post. You know her from the New York Times. You know her from The Laptop from Hell. And she's got a fantastic new book out on Biden corruption. It's out this week. So we are thrilled to have her join us. Miranda, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, both of you.
Well, it's good to be here. So, Eric, this book arrived on our desks. And what was your first thought when you saw the book and the subject matter and, of course, the author?
My first thought was I think we've made a terrible mistake because anything related to Miranda Devine usually gets censored right before an election. So if you're hearing this podcast, then it means things are already better than they were 4 years ago. But I'm afraid that we'll, like her reporting 4 years ago, will be censored and canceled by the big tech machine in furtherance of the Biden-Harris administration agenda.
Yeah, exactly. Censorship because she is so close at the heart of the truth. So, Miranda, it's a terrific book. I read pretty much everything that comes out on Hunter Biden, and I have to say I learned a lot of new things from your book. But let's step back for a minute. I mean, I hear this sometimes. You probably hear it sometimes too. People say, well, Joe Biden's not running for re-election, so I don't care anymore. Tell people why they should care about this story and why this story is still so important.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's the big question. And of course, Joe Biden is not running for office anymore, but the same people in the same crooked institutions that protected him and allowed him and his family to do business and make millions of dollars from our adversaries, particularly from China, are still there. They're still committing bad deeds. They still have malintent, and they still don't have America's best interests at heart. And so I think this book is really about the cover-up of Joe Biden's corruption. Corruption is as old as Washington itself. So there will be other Joe Bidens. But I think the real heart of the problem is those august institutions that American taxpayers pay lots of money to keep us safe, the CIA, the FBI, the DOJ, the IRS, you name it, the State Department. These people, whether rogue actors or whether it's the culture of the places at large, have conspired to damage the American people and particularly to rig the 2020 election so that Donald Trump didn't win and Joe Biden did.
We've talked about that before, how I think your reporting and the censorship of it may single-handedly have been the biggest factor in that election and how we might not even have a Joe Biden if it weren't for the censorship of that story. I wonder what you now think about the fact that Joe Biden, not from his own volition, isn't president in terms of on the ballot anymore. How many of those august institutions, to use your phrases, do you think were involved? And I guess what was your assessment of the removal of Joe Biden as the presidential nominee?
Look, ultimately, I don't think it makes much difference to them. I mean, obviously, they would rather have their long-term puppet, Joe Biden, at the helm, but it became untenable after that debate, and it became obvious that despite the cover-up of his cognitive issues, that the American people were no longer buying it. And so even the sort of media handmaidens of the Democratic Party were up in arms about it. It was just too obvious. And so they've just installed Kamala Harris, who has made it crystal clear in her, particularly her convention speech, but since, that she is a Dick Cheney acolyte, let's call her, as she has the Cheneys on board, and the whole national security establishment is behind her. So it's really situation normal. She's now the next favoured, protected person of that sort of rotten national security establishment that protected Joe Biden for so long and really enabled his family's corruption overseas during his vice presidency, and then put their thumb on the scale during the 2020 election. Have no doubt that they'll be doing that again in 2024. And we've seen 2 assassination attempts now of Donald Trump, and how much did the CIA know, particularly about Ryan Ralph? How aware were they of him?
Yeah, Miranda, you titled the book The Big Guy. The subtitle I really like. It's How a President and His Son Sold Out America. I think that what people are missing is that, yes, this is a Joe Biden story. And in your new book, you go into detail about how the Bidens operated. But the fact that Joe Biden is going to be leaving the stage soon doesn't really address the problem, right? I mean, they're in a sense emblematic of the larger problem that you've got this political class in Washington, D.C., who are increasingly engaged in these kind of global arrangements, these global deals, and you've got this government apparatus that protects them. And that's my concern, is that Joe Biden, the Clintons before him, kind of perfected this model of globalized corruption. And if we know anything about the way things work in Washington, if you get away with this kind of behavior, everybody's going to follow and imitate. So, if in the case that we see Kamala Harris win election, she brings in her new crew. How confident are you that we're going to see this same sort of model played out in the next administration?
You're spot on about that, Peter, because where there's no accountability for bad behavior, of course that bad behavior just metastasizes. We saw that, as you said, with the Clintons got away with blue murder. Joe Biden and Hunter Biden have almost got away with blue murder. I mean, thanks to some very courageous whistleblowers, particularly Gary Shapley and Joe Ziegler, but also John Paul Mac-Isaac, who brought forward the laptop and the various people associated with that. Hunter Biden has now had some measure of sort of legal accountability, although a lot less than he would have if the Department of Justice and David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, hadn't slow-walked that 5-year investigation and obstructed it every step of the way and allowed the statute of limitations to run out on the worst charges. But, so there's been a little bit of accountability, and probably that's thanks to Hunter Biden's sloppiness with the laptop. But I don't think they'll be making that same mistake again. They just, all that seems to happen is that the bad guys just sharpen their weapons, their tools. They get cleverer at covering up. And so this, the laptop from hell, Hunter Biden's laptop, is this window of opportunity that we have. It's given us a glimpse into the belly of the beast. It's really caused great consternation particularly to the cover-up merchants. I mean, we saw with the Dirty 51 letter, as I call it, the letter just before the 2020 election from the 51 former intelligence officials, they really had to come out of the shadows and show their hands with this very clumsy attempt at branding the laptop Russian disinformation. I mean, it worked, but it really showed them to be liars and scam artists. And, you had there, they weren't just any old 51 former intelligence officials. There were 5 former CIA directors or acting directors, including the ubiquitous John Brennan, who's been involved in every dirty trick we've seen in the last decade or so, or actually before that, 9/11. And so that letter, we now find out, we didn't know at the time, but thanks to Congress having some powers of investigation, we now know that that letter was approved at the highest level of the CIA, that Gina Haspel saw it and allowed it to go through. So did her COO, her number 3, Andrew McCreadis. So this is not just a whole lot of rogue former agents from the CIA and other intelligence organizations. This was actually blessed by the CIA itself. So we're in a really parlous situation If Donald Trump were by some miracle to win the election, if they allow him to stay alive and win, then he'll have a heck of a job ahead of him trying to bring the CIA to heel and all those other, the FBI and the DOJ, all those other institutions that have failed the American people.
I guess that's a perfect lead into what I was going to ask you. And if we could just step back and think about what you just said and the era that we live in, if the highest levels of the American intelligence apparatus essentially helped deliver the last election for Joe Biden by lying about legitimate intelligence that showed how compromised Joe and Hunter Biden were. How does that inform your assessment of the fact that there have now been 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump, the candidate, assassination attempts with a lot of questions regarding the actions of the Secret Service? And you yourself raised, what do we know about Ryan Routh? Where did he come from? How did he know he would be golfing? I mean, how does what you've lived through with everything related to the intelligence in that letter inform your perception of the assassination attempts now?
Well, I mean, extreme cynicism is my attitude that the FBI is going to do anything, about exposing really what's behind these assassination attempts. We know, for instance, that there were Five Eyes countries that were trying to warn the Biden-Harris administration that there were severe threats to Donald Trump's life, and they were alarmed at the lackadaisical security around Donald Trump. That was before the first assassination attempt. Now we see that even after Donald Trump was shot in the ear and almost died, could have been killed, and other people, another man was killed and 2 seriously injured in Butler, Pennsylvania. Even after that very serious attempt, still the Secret Service and the Biden-Harris administration is not giving him adequate security. And so that raises a big red flag. And then, as I said, Ryan Routh was, it's similar to Hunter Biden, this very unsuitable person. Hunter Biden was a crack addict and Ryan Routh looks half unhinged. Were ricocheting around Ukraine and various other countries and seemed to have the protection of somebody very high up in the federal government, because there have been at least 5 occasions that Ryan Routh came to the attention of the federal government. For instance, John Solomon had a terrific story this week about how last year when Ryan Routh arrived here from Ukraine after one of his trips, he was stopped by Customs and Border Protection, and they questioned him, and there were several red flags raised, and they referred him to Homeland Security for investigation, and no investigation was done. And that was a pattern. I mean, that's there was a CIA operative who warned about him. There was a nurse who warned about him twice. Ryan Routh was someone who raised a lot of concerns with people who were around him, and yet he seemed to, like Hunter Biden, have this sort of Teflon shield of protection, some invisible hand guiding him. So I think, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida is quite right to say that he doesn't really trust the FBI to conduct this investigation, and that Florida is going to be doing their own investigation. And remember, the FBI, it wasn't just the CIA with that Dirty 51 letter that censored our story back in 2020 about the laptop. It was the FBI which had conducted a very sophisticated operation with big tech, with Twitter and Facebook and other agencies, where they pre-bunked our story, having been spying on Rudy Giuliani and having known that they'd had hold of the laptop for a year themselves, and knowing that it was not Russian disinformation. They still briefed Twitter and Facebook to expect this Russian hack and leak dump that looked very much like our story. And so, of course, those tech giants immediately censored our story because they recognized it as being what the FBI had been warning them about. So that's a really frightening situation. And I mean, once you unravel the FBI operation to pre-bunk our story, they went to elaborate lengths. So they were obviously very concerned that Joe Biden would be exposed.
We're talking with Miranda Devine. She's got a terrific new book out called The Big Guy, How a President and Her Son Sold Out America. Just to pick up on what you just said, Miranda, it seems to me that we're at a point in time in history where I have never seen such a yawning gap between the perception of where we are in the country to the reality of where we are, and particularly when it comes to the flow of information. I mean, you talk to most people and they're going to say, oh, we have the internet. We have a multitude of information. People can find information on anything they want. And yet what you're saying, and I think what reality is playing out, is if you control just a handful, even a less than a handful of institutions, the intelligence community, big tech, the executive branch, you have a remarkable ability to suppress information and prevent information from coming out. And so the question becomes, let's say Trump wins in November. Let's say Republicans retain Congress. What are the concrete steps that you would suggest they do simply in the name of press freedom? Because you are a journalist, you've been a journalist for a long time. How do we actually root out at the deepest roots, furthest down in the soil? How do we deal with this problem? Because if we don't correct this problem, things are only going to get worse. They're not going to get better. Well,
I mean, I think the first and most important thing to do is to break up these big tech monopolies. How does Twitter and Facebook, Google, how do they manage to deplatform a sitting president as they did to Donald Trump before the 2020 election? There's a professor, Dr. Robert Epstein, who set up this sort of monitoring project where he looks at the bias in, for instance, Google search, and it's off the charts, and particularly before elections on the liberal side, on the Democrat side. It's very difficult. I mean, we're seeing mass brainwashing of the population. And while, the sort of mainstream traditional elite newspaper organizations and broadcast organizations have lost a huge amount of trust from the public, it's really only conservatives who seem to care. If you look at polls, you see that something like 3/4 of conservatives don't trust the media, but 3/4 of Democrats do trust the media. And so, I think that Donald Trump has got a big road ahead of him to try and break up those big tech monopolies and then get into those institutions, CIA, FBI, DOJ, and clean house. That's going to be very difficult. You'd have to, of course, remember with the Frank Church had that very good congressional inquiry, which seemed to stem the problem for a little bit. But at the time, they realized that in 40 years' time, there would be a problem with the intelligence agencies again. They're unaccountable, and they seem to be stacked now, at least since the Obama era, with people who are not patriots and who don't have America's best interests at heart.
By the way, I was laughing just because it's kind of like you live through these things and they just kind of seem like, well, they're just happening. But Donald Trump was deplatformed for our safety. It's like we're all safer now that the president has had a Twitter account taken away. Thank God. Thank you so much. And that's like a normal thing that happened. Everybody's like, well, that's right. Thank God that problem's over. It's now safe to go outside. You're reporting on this, and I was joking with Peter. It's so nice, I have to tell you, Miranda, to finally be speaking to an expert on Joe and Hunter Biden and their corruption. So this is just a wonderful moment for me. But
thank you.
But I was going to say, one of the things we reported on, you reported on in the book, is Hunter Biden's business ties to China and how it may or may not have influenced U.S. government policy. And Joe Biden had this relationship with then Vice President Xi at the same time that Hunter Biden's getting these business deals unprecedented with the government of China. What do you make of the fact that that Joe Biden's replaced on the ticket with a guy who has maybe even stronger ties to China than Hunter Biden did in Tim Walz? You've seen the reporting about his anniversaries on the same anniversary of Tiananmen Square. He's traveled there 30 times. There's suspicion he may have been cultivated as an intelligence asset by Chinese espionage officials. I mean, having done the reporting on the way people pursued business relationships with Hunter Biden for strategic purposes, what do you think about the fact that one Biden was replaced with Tim Walz?
It's really uncanny, isn't it? Frightening that Tim Walz has had these, 30 years of traveling backwards and forwards to China. According to his former students, he loves Mao and, preaches Maoism. There's no way he could have done all that while being serving as a reserve defense person without the CIA and the intelligence agencies being aware of what he was up to. So I find it quite frightening. We know that Joe Biden, because of all the millions of dollars that his family took in from communist China, and Peter, you've covered that brilliantly in your reporting, we know that logic tells you that he was compromised. And then, the circumstantial evidence of the way Joe Biden unraveled various Trump-era restraints on China's spying. For instance, Joe Biden dismantled an FBI program that was quite successful and was trying to stamp out spying at universities. And even Christopher Wray was chagrined when Joe Biden did that. So there was all sorts of leniency by Joe Biden towards China. And this weekend, Joe Biden's showing utter contempt to the leaders of the Quad, which is Australia, India, and Japan, which was set up many years ago, way before Joe Biden, to sort of stem China's activities in the Indo-Pacific. And Joe Biden India was supposed to be hosting it, and Joe Biden was invited to New Delhi in January, and it was going to be a big occasion, and he just couldn't be bothered going. And so now, almost the end of his term, he's had to have a Quad meeting. So he doesn't want to give up a weekend in Wilmington. So he has these leaders coming to Wilmington, to his podunk hometown, to do this very cursory meeting. And so I think that shows you where Joe Biden and the Harris-Biden administration is when it comes to putting a check on China's growing aggression in that part of the world. And I think we'll just see more of the same, because if Kamala Harris wins, she is just a cipher for the powers that be. And Tim Walz obviously has this pre-existing bizarre, very curious relationship with the CCP.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's the fear, right? If Kamala Harris wins, they're going to default to Tim Walz essentially being the point person on China because he's been there 30 times. He speaks a little bit of the language. It's a frightening prospect. I want to get to the book real quick, Miranda. The Big Guy, it's out this week. Tell me, again, you've been covering this for years. I've covered it for years. What was the biggest surprise to you in writing this book? In terms of, it's easy, here's another Hunter deal on top of all the other Hunter deals, but give us something that surprised you when you completed this book that the audience, I think, will find interesting.
I think really it's the extent of Joe Biden's in sort of embedding it with the intelligence services with the CIA. And I would say that Hunter Biden himself, he was, just before he took up the reins at Burisma and was earning $1 million a year on the Burisma board in Ukraine, he was appointed to a CIA cutout part of the National Endowment for Democracy. And that's a most bizarre, Mitt Romney was in the Republican version of that, and now Hunter Biden is in the Democrat version of that. He proudly displayed that on his resume. And so I would say that we will see Joe Biden pardoning his son. And no doubt Joe Biden will say, look, I will now reveal that Hunter Biden was actually working for our government. He was not doing anything nefarious. He was actually helping us, and he was doing the work of the American government, just as I was when I fired Victor Shokin. and that's why I'm pardoning him. That you can just sort of see Hunter Biden being framed now as being a hero and a patriot rather than, a corrupt slimeball son of a crackhead, son of a very privileged family.
Hey, Miranda, you've been amazing. Last question from me. How do you help people reconcile the idea that Joe Biden was involved to the extent that he was, you just said, and had kind of an active role with Hunter Biden and some of those business deals, while at the same time, the version that we see Joe Biden on that debate stage, so some people would say, you can't have it both ways. You can't be this very clever businessman who's making money off your political corruption at the same time being so cognitively addled you can't function in the office of the presidency.
Yeah, look, I think that for a long time through his presidency, Joe Biden was, he had the sort of twilight lights on situation that a lot of people do in his situation. So he had enough sort of cognitive ability to be able to still command people around him, and they did sort of what he wanted, and you saw the disasters of that in Afghanistan. Certainly during his vice presidency, he was completely aware of what he was doing when he came and met Hunter's Chinese, Ukrainian, Russian, Kazakhstani partners, talked to them on the speakerphone, and so on. And, I have no doubt that when Hunter Biden sent that shakedown WhatsApp message to one of his Chinese partners, and he said that he was sitting with his father, I have no doubt that his father was there, because we know that Hunter was in Wilmington at that time, and so was Joe Biden. And Joe was intimately involved in every aspect of that business, and he knew he was a product being sold, and he made himself available as part of the sales pitch. That was the family business, and they all benefited from it financially.
Well, if you want to understand that story really, really well, I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the new book by Miranda Devine. I think everything that Miranda writes is worth reading. Miranda, thanks for making the time with us. We really enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to much more reporting from you down the road.
Thanks so much, Peter and Eric. Great to talk to you.
And we thank you, the audience, for taking time, as always, to listen to this podcast. You can find out more about the research we do at thedrilldown.com. And, of course, you can get this podcast wherever fine podcasts are located. Until next time, thank you.